Juliusz Słowacki was a Polish Romantic poet. He is considered one of the three bards of Polish literature, a major figure in the Polish Romantic period, and the father of modern Polish drama. His works often feature elements of Slavic pagan traditions, Polish history, mysticism and orientalism. His style includes the employment of neologisms and irony. His primary genre was the drama, but he also wrote lyric poetry. His most popular works include the dramas Accordion and Balladina and the poems Beniowski and Testament. Moj. Słowacki spent his youth in the stolen lands, in Kremenets and Vilnius. He briefly worked for the government of the Kingdom of Poland. During the November 1830 uprising, he was a courier for the Polish revolutionary government. When the uprising ended in defeat, he found himself abroad and thereafter, like many compatriots, lived the life of an émigré. He settled briefly in Paris, France, and later in Geneva, Switzerland. He also traveled through Italy, Greece and the Middle East. Eventually he returned to Paris, where he spent the last decade of his life. He briefly returned to Poland when another uprising broke out during the Spring of Nations. Youth emigration. Like many of his countrymen, Słowacki decided to stay in France as a political refugee. In 1832, he published his first collections of poems and his first two dramas. He also met Mickiewicz again. Reportedly, Mickiewicz approached his younger colleague and shook his hand. However, Słowacki's poems, written in the 1820s, were unpopular among his Polish compatriots, as they failed to capture the sentiment of a people living under foreign occupation. Słowacki was angered by Mickiewicz, who not only stole the limelight with his Księgi Narodu Polskiego I Pielgrzymstwo Polskiego, but his Part 3 of Jadika Słowacki's stepfather, Professor B.E. Akutcu, in the role of a villain. In a letter to his mother, Słowacki wrote that immediately after reading that work he was ready to challenge Mickiewicz for a duel that did not come to pass, but from that moment on, Słowacki would see Mickiewicz as his main rival. Few days later, antagonized by worsening reception of his works among the Polish émigré community in Paris, including sharp criticism from Mickiewicz, Słowacki left on a trip to Geneva, Switzerland. The French authorities denied him the right to return to France as part of a larger program to rid the country of the potentially subversive Polish exiles who had settled there. From 1833 to 36, he lived in Switzerland. A third volume of his poems, published in 1833 and containing works from the period of the uprising, was far more nationalist in tone, and won more recognition in his homeland. At the same time, he wrote several works featuring romantic themes and beautiful scenery, such as W. Słodkie Rozluźnienie, Stokrotki and Szmery. In 1834 he published the drama Accordion, the romantic drama, illustrating the soul-searching of the Polish people in the aftermath of the failed insurrection. This work is considered one of his best creations. In 1836, Słowacki left Switzerland and embarked on a journey that started in Italy. In Rome he met and befriended Zygmunt Krasinski, the third of the three bards. Krasinski is also considered the first serious literary critic of Słowacki's work. Słowacki would dedicate several of his works, including Balladina, to Krasinski. From Rome, Słowacki went to Naples and later to Sorrento. In August he left for Greece, Egypt and the Middle East, including the Holy Land and neighboring territories. It was a journey Słowacki described in his epic poem Podróż Ziemi Wyjazdnia Polu. His other works of that period included the poem Ojciech, Zadzuminich, Grob Agamemnon, Rosmo Wezet Pyramidami, Angeli and Listi Poetiki Zad Egypt II. In June 1837 he returned to Italy, settling briefly in Florence, and moved back to Paris in December 1838. In 1840 Mickiewicz was elected to the position of Professor of Slavic Literature at Collège de France. It was one of the events that cemented his position over Słowacki in the Polish émigré community. The rivalry between the two bards for primacy will continue till the ends of lives. In 1841 Słowacki travelled briefly to Frankfurt, but Paris would become his main home till his death. In 1840 and 1841 he wrote two notable dramas, Mazeppa, the only of his dramas that was put on stage during his lifetime, and Fantasy, published posthumously, well received by critics. Over the next few years Słowacki wrote and published many works, including Testament Moj, in which he described his faith that his works would endure after his death. Between 1841 and 1846 he published Beniowski, considered by some his best lyrical poetry. Starting as a story of a historical figure, it developed into a discussion of the poet's own life and opinions. In 1842 he joined the religious philosophical group Kolos Prori Boze, led by Andrzej Towiański. This group included, among others, Mickiewicz. Towiański's influence is credited with a new, mystical current in Słowacki's works, seen in works such as the poem Beniowski and the drama Kasiad's Marek. Słowacki left the circle a year later, in 1843. In the summers of 1843 and 1844 Słowacki travelled to Pornic, a resort on the Atlantic coast in Brittany. It was there, in 1844, that he wrote Genesis Seducha. This work introduced his own philosophical system that would have a visible influence on his works in his last decade. Around 1839 Słowacki put his capital into the Parisian stock market. He was a shrewd investor who earned enough from the investments to dedicate his life to his literary career. He was also able to pay the costs of having his books published. Last years in the late 1840s Słowacki attached himself to a group of like-minded young exiles, determined to return to Poland and win its independence. One of his friends was the pianist and composer Frédéric Chopin. Others included enthusiasts of his work, such as Zygmunt Szczytny-Feliński, Joseph Aloysius and Hyman Joseph Komiarowski. Despite poor health, when he heard about the events of the Spring of Nations, Słowacki traveled with some friends to Poznan, then under Prussian control, hoping to participate in the Wielkopolska uprising of 1848. He addressed the National Committee in Poznan on the 27th of April. "I tell you," he declared as the rebels faced military confrontation with the Prussian army, "that the new age has dawned, the age of holy anarchy." But by the 9th of May, the revolt was crushed. Arrested by the Prussian police, Słowacki was sent back to Paris. On his way there, he passed through Wrocław, where in mid-June he was reunited with his mother, whom he had not seen for almost 20 years. He returned to Paris in July 1848. His poem Papier Słowiański, published in late 1848, gained new fame a century later when it seemed to foretell the 1978 ascent of Karol Wojtyła to the throne of St. Peter as Pope John Paul II. His final dramas attempted to explain the history of Poland through Słowacki's Genesis philosophy. In March 1849, Słowacki, his health failing, was visited 3 times poems by another Polish writer and poet, Cyprian Norwood, who later wrote about his visits in Zanquity. Up to his final days, Słowacki was writing poetry. A day before his death he dictated passages of his final work, Krol Dutch. This grandiose, visionary symbolic poem, summary of the entire Romantic culture, Słowacki's masterpiece, weaving together Poland's history and its contemporary political and literary thought, was never finished. Słowacki died in Paris on 3 April 1849 from tuberculosis, and on 5 April he was buried in the Montmartre cemetery in Paris. He never married. Only about 30 people attended his funeral. Krasinski, although estranged from Słowacki in the last few years, wrote of the funeral. Słowacki's tombstone at Montmartre was designed by his friend and executor of his last will, painter Charles Patinero Dubos. It did not weather the passage of time well, however, and in 1851 a new, similar tombstone was put in place. This one designed by Polish sculptor Władysław Oleszczynski. In 1927 Słowacki's remains were moved to Warel Cathedral in Poland, but an empty grave still remains at Montmartre. Work. Słowacki was a prolific writer. His collected works were published in 17 volumes. His legacy includes 25 dramas and 253 works of poetry. He wrote in many genres: dramas, lyrical poems, literary criticism, letters, journals and memoirs, fragments of 2 novels, and a political brochure. He was also a translator. His letters to his mother are among the finest letters in all Polish literature. Although the majority of his works were in Polish, he tried his hand at several works in French language. Many of his works were published only posthumously, or often under arbitrary titles, as Słowacki never named them himself. He also left notes on works that he never began and never completed. Słowacki is also considered the father of modern Polish drama. Polish literary historian Włodzimierz Sturk divides Słowacki's work into 4 periods: Walter's Circle, Christian ethic, Towiański's ethic and Genesic ethic. Other scholars offer slightly different periodizations, for example dividing his works into a classical period, a Swiss period, a Parisian period and a Genesis period. Jarosław Lawski combines Towiański's period with the Genesic ones, speaking of a mystical period. Overall, Słowacki's early work was influenced by Byron and Shakespeare, and included works that was often historical in nature, like, or exotic, oriental locales. His work took on a more patriotic tone following the failed November insurrection of 1830 to 1831. His final works are heavy in mystical and philosophical undertones. In the 1840s he developed his own philosophy, or mystical system, with works such as Krol Dutch and Genesis Z Dutch being an exposition of his philosophical ideas according to which the material world is an expression of an ever-improving spirit capable of progression into constantly newer forms. As Lawski notes, his philosophical works can transcend clear boundaries of simple literary genres. Słowacki's works, situated in the period of Romanticism in Poland, contain rich and inventive vocabulary, including many neologisms. They use fantasy, mysticism and symbolism and feature themes related to Poland's history, essence of Polishness, and relation to a larger universe. Lawski, enumerating the main characteristics of Słowacki's writings, notes first that he was a creationist, in the sense of creating new meanings and words. Second, he notes that Słowacki was not only inspired by works of others, from poets and writers to scholars and philosophers, but that his texts were often a masterful, ironic, grotesque polemic with other creators. For example, Słowacki was so impressed by Antoni Malczewski's Maria that he wrote a sequel to it, Jan Bilecki. Likewise, Gordian is seen as building building on William Shakespeare's Hamlet, and as Słowacki's response to Mickiewicz's Jadi. Słowacki calls ivy-like imagination, comparing Słowacki's approach to that of an ivy, growing around works of others and reshaping them into new forms in a sophisticated literary game. Third, Słowacki was a master of irony. He used it not only on others, but on himself, and even on irony itself, the irony of irony. Legacy. After his death, Słowacki acquired the reputation of a national prophet. He is now considered to be one of the three bards of Polish literature. Słowacki was not a very popular figure in Paris, nor among his contemporaries. He wrote many dramas, which can be seen as his favorite genre, yet he was a playwright who never saw any of his work performed on stage. His works, written in Polish, dense with Slavic myths, philosophy and symbols, were difficult to translate to other languages. Słowacki's unpopularity among other Polish émigrés can be attributed to his unwillingness to pander to contemporary tastes, and in particular, his refusal to comfort his compatriots, shaken by the loss of Polish statehood and the failure of the November uprising. Słowacki's ironic and sometimes pessimistic attitude was not appreciated by his contemporaries, nor was his denial of Polish uniqueness, whereas Mickiewicz followed the messianic tradition and in Conrad suggested that Poland's fate was in the hands of God. Słowacki's Cordian questioned whether his country was not instead a plaything of Satan. However, the same work has God and the angels watching over Poland and the earth. In Angeli, Słowacki describes the tragic fate of Polish exiles in Siberia, painting a gloomy vision of Poland's destiny. The same topic was taken by Mickiewicz in the books of the Polish Nation and of the Polish Pilgrimage, as a call for Poles to spread hope and spirituality across Europe. While a small circle of his friends talked about his wit, perseverance and inspiration, in popular memory he was a sickly man of weak character, egocentric, bitter due to his failed rivalry with Mickiewicz. Mickiewicz himself wrote of Słowacki's work as a beautiful church but without God inside. After his death, Słowacki gained a cult-like status in Poland, in particular in the cultural center of Kraków. Several obituaries and longer articles appeared in the Polish press upon Słowacki's death. His works, many of them published posthumously for the first time, found growing acceptance among a new generation. An 1868 work noted that Słowacki took the fancy of the Polish youth. He was its singer, its spiritual leader in the full meaning of the term. Through undoubtedly a poet of the Romantic era, he was increasingly popular among the positivists and the authors of the Young Poland period in the late 1800s and early 1900s. His works were popularized by other writers, such as Adamaeus Nyk and Michał Balucki, and his dramas were shown in theaters. He became a major literary figure for the new generation of Polish writers. He also became respected abroad. In 1902, English-language book edited by Charles Dudley Warner noted that the splendid exuberance of his thought and fancy ranks him among the great poets of the 19th century. In 1927, some 8 years after Poland had regained independence, the Polish government arranged for Słowacki's remains to be transferred from Paris to Worel Cathedral in Kraków. He was interred in the crypt of the National Bards, beside Mickiewicz. Słowacki's interment at Worel Cathedral was controversial, as many of his works were considered heretical by Polish Catholic Church officials. It took almost 2 decades and the backing of Józef Pilsudski, for whom Słowacki was a favorite poet, to obtain the Church's agreement to interring Słowacki at Worel Cathedral. At the 1927 ceremony, Pilsudski commanded, "Several streets and schools in modern Poland bear Juliusz Słowacki's name. 3 parks are dedicated to him, in Bielsko-Biała, in Łódź and in Wrocław. There are several monuments of Juliusz Słowacki, including ones in Warsaw and Wrocław. Among the most notable landmarks bearing his name is the Juliusz Słowacki Theatre in Kraków, and the Juliusz Słowacki Museum in Kremenets, Ukraine, opened in 2004 at his family's former manor house. In 2009 the Polish Sejm declared that year, the 200th anniversary of Słowacki's birth, to be the year of Juliusz Słowacki. Selected works: drama, balladina, fantasy, Horstinsky, Cordian, Kaziadzmarek, Kaziazny Lila Wineda, Maria Stuart, Mazepa, Sensrabny Salome, Samuel Zadborowski, Poetry Angeli, Arab, Lambro, Paustanko Greki, Beniowski, Genezis Zedacha, Godzina Myslai, Hugo, Poesk Shizaka, Krol Dutch, Ojciech Zadzuminich, Pedrozda Zimiswache, Testament Moj, W. Swaj K. The Voutswi.